Oh,
Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for joining us. We will begin with just a brief welcome while we let the others join. My name is Emily Herman Cusick, and I am one of the co-chairs of Georgia Legislative Day 2021. As a reminder, Georgia Legislative Day will be held virtually this year on Wednesday, February 3rd, with programming from 9 to 12 and meetings with our elected officials from 1 to 3. Please make sure to register for this event early, as we will be scheduling meetings with your elected officials based on your address that you put in the registration form. Today, we are so excited to offer the second of 3 pre-event webinars. You're about to hear from Raymond Partolan, esteemed immigration paralegal, activist, and 3-time Grammy Award winner, who will speak on student protections in DACA. On Thursday, January 28th at 2:30 p.m., we will hear from David Hawkins with SACAC, who will speak on student to counselor ratios here in Georgia. Without further ado, I will pass it off to Raymond to get started. Thank you again for being here.
awesome. Thank you all so much for having me. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. 1 second. Okay, share screen. All right. Can everyone see that okay?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. Well, Kaylee and Emily, thank you both so much for the invitation and for having me today. For all of the folks that are here in the audience, thank you all for being a part of this pre-legislative day webinar. I did a similar talk like this a couple of years ago for SACAC. I think that's how you say it, SACAC. And thoroughly enjoyed it. I think it was a great opportunity for educators and counselors to come together and hear about issues that impact higher education and perhaps the students that all of you advise and counsel. So I wanted to take a couple of minutes today. We have about 20 to 25 minutes or so before we open it up for questions to talk about what it means to be undocumented in this country and what it means to be undocumented and want to go to college. There are a number of challenges that exist for folks here in the state of Georgia that are undocumented and want to go to college. And we're also going to be talking about some similar states that border Georgia that have similar policies. I hope that with this conversation that we're going to have today, that you'll have an arsenal of tools that you'll be able to use when you go meet with your legislators next month during your legislative day. So we're going to be talking about student protections, DACA, different forms of immigration status, and how all of these things factor into an undocumented student or a student with DACA trying to go to college. So today's conversation to me is important because immigration is kind of a touchy subject, you know, especially over the last couple of years. It's been all over the news. Politicians and elected officials like to talk about immigration and the things that they'd like to do to influence immigration policy. So although we're really here to talk about higher education and making sure that undocumented students have the right advice and the right counsel as they're applying to schools, we do want to recognize that a lot of this discussion is in the national context. It's in the political context. We want you all to be able to create a more inclusive learning environment in your schools. We want to establish dialogue and connections between diverse groups. We want to be able to effectively advocate for undocumented students. And we want to encourage people as a whole to have a more positive understanding about the kinds of challenges that undocumented students face. So a little bit about my professional background. Currently, I work as an immigration paralegal at Kuck Baxter Immigration. It's an immigration law firm in the Atlanta area. We are the largest immigration law firm in the Southeast, and we handle all kinds of immigration issues. I've been here about 4 years now, and I generally work on complex family-based immigration issues and also removal defense. So if an individual is in danger of being deported from the United States or removed from the United States, I am the guy that's helping the attorney represent that individual. It's something that I love. In the last couple of years, I've gotten some big wins. I've helped people apply for asylum and win asylum here in the United States. I've helped people gain their permanent residency, their citizenship. And before working at this particular law firm, I worked for a couple of years at a nonprofit organization here in Atlanta called Asian Americans Advancing Justice. And so immigration runs through my blood. A little bit about my personal background. I came to the US when I was 1 from the Philippines, and I've never been back ever since. And when I was 10 years old, my family lost our immigration status. We became undocumented. We lost the ability to legally stay here in the United States. And so from the age of 10 till about the age of 19, I was completely undocumented. I didn't have any kind of status, and my future was pretty perilous because I had no idea whether I was going to be able to go to college, if I was ever going to legally hold a job, if I was ever going to legally have a driver's license. These are the kinds of things that undocumented people in our country have to face on a daily basis. And then when I was 19, President Obama announced the DACA program, which I'm sure many, if not all of you, have heard of. The DACA program is, and we're going to be talking about this in detail in just a couple of minutes, but the DACA program is a special program that was enacted by Barack Obama in 2012 that provides a limited form of protection for young undocumented people. And so I became a beneficiary of that program when I was 19. And through that program, I was able to get a driver's license, a social security card, and I was ultimately able to continue my college education and was ultimately able to graduate from college and go on to work legally in my profession. So all of that being said, this is an issue that is very near and dear to my heart. Both of my parents were undocumented until they became permanent residents a couple of years ago, when my younger brother was able to petition for them. And thankfully, I myself became a permanent resident just about 2 months ago, which is a pretty big deal because I have spent about 26 years of my life without any kind of semblance of permanency in my future. So I'm super excited about that, but just moving right along. And if you guys have any questions at all, we are going to be taking questions at the end. So if you have questions, just put them in the chat, or just be ready to ask them whenever we get to the end. Okay. So let's talk about our agenda a little bit. These are the main 3 things that I want to cover today in the next couple of minutes. One, I want to talk some basics. What does it mean to be undocumented? What does it mean to have DACA? What is some of this terminology? What are some of the terminology that we use to describe the different legal statuses that people can have throughout different stages of the process? The reason this is important is because we want to make sure that when we're advising these students, that we understand completely what kind of legal situation they're in, because depending on their status, they may or may not have access to admission at certain schools, in-state tuition at certain schools, etc. I want to tackle specifically the challenges that undocumented students face here in the state of Georgia, but also in our neighboring states of Alabama and South Carolina. And we're also going to talk about some states here in our country that actually, in my opinion, do things right when it comes to undocumented students and ensuring that undocumented students have as much access to higher education as possible. And then the last thing we'll talk about is some ways that I think would be great for college admissions counselors to engage in advocacy work for the students that they serve, whether that's legislative advocacy or legal advocacy, or just some advice as to how you can better counsel and advise your students. I'll talk more about this later, but being undocumented was single-handedly the greatest challenge that I had ever had to face in my life. And the lowest points in my life as an undocumented person were when I was in high school and when I thought all hope was lost for me to be able to go to college one day. And there were a couple of people who worked at my high school who were counselors and who were teachers who were super supportive of my desire to go to college. And I can share some about the kinds of things that they did that made me feel supported as an undocumented student. So I know there's a lot of words on this page, and I'm going to try and go through it really quickly, but I think it's important to understand some of the basic terminology here. When we talk about people who are here in the United States who are not US citizens, we're talking about aliens. So I know it sounds really weird, and in some contexts, it can be a derogatory phrase, you know, like if you're watching some news media or you're speaking to someone who may not be as friendly towards undocumented people as others, you might hear the phrase illegal alien or illegal immigrant. And all of that means that someone is here in the United States and they don't have legal status. But there can be aliens in the United States who do have legal status. For example, a person with permanent residence is also an alien, but they have legal status in the United States. An immigrant is someone who comes to live in the United States permanently. And there are ways to gain your lawful permanent residence and to be able to legally live here in this country on a permanent basis. A non-immigrant is someone who seeks temporary entrance into the United States for a specific purpose. So when people come here on a visitor visa or a student visa, you might come across some of these folks as you're engaging in your college admissions counseling. These people are non-immigrants, and depending on their specific legal status, they may or may not be able to go to school or go to college here in the US without changing their status to something that would allow it. Some of you may work with F1 students. These are students who are here in F1 status, and these people are allowed to go to college, but that particular college that they want to attend has to certify or endorse them so that they can study. A US citizen is obviously someone who has US citizenship. They were either born here in this country or they naturalized, or they acquired or derived their citizenship through their parents or through some other means. An undocumented person is someone who has no legal status, as we already mentioned. We'll skip removal proceedings. That's basically just when someone is in danger of being removed from the country. And then DACA, I've already kind of talked about it, but it stands for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And it's a special program for specific undocumented young people who meet certain criteria. And an individual with DACA is protected from removal from the United States for a temporary period of time. And during that time, they can work, they can receive what's called work authorization. In most states, including the state of Georgia, they can get a driver's license. You can get a social security card through the DACA program. It has now benefited at least 700,000 undocumented young people in the United States, but it does not confer any kind of lawful status. So moving along here. There are differences between being undocumented and having DACA, or some people would say being DACA-mented. So being undocumented means that someone has no status, period, that they are at risk for removal. If the federal government were to realize that they were here in this country without status, they can be placed into removal proceedings where an immigration judge would make the decision as to whether or not they're allowed to stay here in the United States. When an individual is undocumented, they can't get a driver's license in most states, including the state of Georgia. They don't have a social security number, no access to public benefits, period. One of the misconceptions about undocumented people in this country is that they come here to to seek public benefits and to seek aid from the government to support their family. But legally speaking, that's just not possible. There are no provisions in the law that allow for undocumented people to accept public benefits. And in this particular context, in the context of higher education, undocumented people have it worst of all here in the state of Georgia and in our surrounding states when it comes to being able to access higher education. Now, when an individual has DACA, they, as I mentioned, don't have lawful status in the United States, but they are lawfully present in the United States, which we're going to cover a little bit more later. But basically, this means that while a person has DACA, they're not actually accruing unlawful presence in this country, and they can gain certain benefits. They have to qualify. I'm not going to go over all of the qualifications in detail right now, but basically an individual had to come here to the US before the age of 16. They had to have been present here on a certain date, and they cannot have a significant criminal history. That means any individual who has more than 3 misdemeanors, 1 significant misdemeanor, or a felony is automatically disqualified from being a part of the DACA program. So people with DACA have it a little bit better off than undocumented people when they're seeking higher education, but it's still not where immigration activists like myself would like to see it. So here in the state of Georgia, some of you may already be familiar with this, but there are 2 specific policies that address access to higher education for undocumented students. There's policy 4.1.6 and policy 4.3.4. 416 is a policy that basically prohibits undocumented students, whether or not they have DACA, to be able to matriculate or enroll in certain colleges and universities here in the state. So the language says that if a school did not admit all academically qualified students or applicants over the last, I believe, 2 years, then they cannot accept anyone who does not have legal status, whether they have DACA or not. So effectively and functionally, this means that DACA students and undocumented students are banned from the University of Georgia, Georgia Tech, and Georgia College and State University. So if you're undocumented, if you have DACA, you can basically kiss your dreams of going to these schools goodbye, because it's not going to happen under current Board of Regents policy. Policy 4.3.4 requires undocumented students, regardless of whether they have DACA, to pay out-of-state tuition at the other schools here in the state of Georgia where they can attend. So places like Georgia State or Georgia Southern, or the University of West Georgia, etc. Any school that's not UGA, Georgia Tech, or GCSU. Allow undocumented students to enroll, but they have to pay out-of-state tuition, which is 3 to 4 times greater than in-state tuition. Now, consider the fact that the majority of these students who are undocumented, who are trying to go to these schools, have lived here in the state of Georgia most, if not all, of their lives. And the only thing that sets them apart from their peers who are US citizens are the fact that they don't have the legal paperwork to say or to show that they have permission to stay here permanently in the United States. And if we had more time, we'd talk about the ways that people could gain lawful permanent residence, but that's not really the focus of the discussion for today. But one thing that I do want to say is it's a lot more difficult than people think to gain permanent residence in this country and to ultimately gain US citizenship. There's a lot of misconceptions out there about what it takes to become a US citizen. And if you're interested, I would encourage you to read up some more on that subject, so that if you do encounter students who need this kind of help, you can point them in the right direction. So next, we're going to talk about South Carolina and Alabama, but I'm going to try and breeze through it because I want to make sure that we have a chance to answer your questions. South Carolina is a little bit better than Georgia insofar as in 2013, the South Carolina Commission on Higher Education determined that DACA recipients, not undocumented people, people who are completely undocumented, but DACA recipients are eligible to enroll in their public colleges and universities. The DACA protections must be verified with the federal government. However, even though they're able to attend these schools, it's not like Georgia where we completely ban students from certain schools. They have to pay out-of-state tuition at each of these schools. So just like we see here in Georgia, the biggest barrier to going to college in South Carolina is possibly being able to pay for it. They are financial barriers. In South Carolina, there are specific schools that allow DACA recipients, again, not undocumented students, but DACA recipients to enroll and to pay in-state tuition. So those are the schools that are listed here. And so in some ways, Alabama is actually better than Georgia when it comes to access to higher education. There's no specific policies that address financial aid for undocumented students and DACA recipients in Alabama. But these are just, these are two examples of two neighboring states that have policies that are different than what we have here in the state of Georgia. One second here. I wanted to come back here and say just really quickly, in 1982, the United States Supreme Court, in a ruling in a case called Plyler versus Doe, ruled that everyone in the United States, regardless of immigration status, that means undocumented people, have the right to a K-12 education, to receive a free public education from kindergarten until 12th grade. But that ruling in Plyler versus Doe doesn't extend to higher education. And because of that, states are required to pass their own laws and promulgate their own policies when it comes to these issues. Okay. So just really quickly, I want to close out our discussion today by talking about effectively advocating for undocumented students whom you may come across in your work as a college admissions counselor. I've broken it down into 3 buckets: legislative and political advocacy, which you all are going to do next month on your legislative day; appropriate guidance and advice for students who you may be advising, for students who want to go to college but who need some advice, some counsel on how to get there. And then we're going to be talking about legal advocacy, some legal action that has already taken place and some potential legal action for the future that you all may be a part of. If this is an issue that is important to you, and you're interested in being a plaintiff one day, or encouraging one of your students to be a plaintiff in a lawsuit to increase access to higher education, that's what we're going to be talking about. So on the legislative front, here in the state of Georgia, the governor appoints the members of the Board of Regents. That means that elections have consequences, that whoever we elect into the governorship, depending on their own policy preferences, has the ability to determine essentially what kind of policies the Board of Regents promulgates when it comes to higher education for undocumented students. Over the years, a couple of bills, some legislation has been introduced to allow DACA recipients to pay in-state tuition at public colleges and universities here in the state of Georgia. The legislative session just started earlier this week. There may be another in-state tuition bill this year, but if there is one, I would encourage all of you to do everything you can to support that. Calling your representatives, your senators, going to the Capitol and actually speaking to your representatives in person. I don't know how much of that is happening this year for obvious reasons, but there's this thing called the rope line where people actually go to the Capitol and speak to their representatives and their senators across a rope. And you get about 30 seconds to a minute to give them your piece and to encourage them to support legislation that is good for undocumented students. when it comes to appropriate guidance and advice, these are just some of the points that came to mind when I was thinking about the ways in which my college counselors when I was in high school supported me, the ways in which my teachers supported me when I was in high school. But I think first and foremost, just be sensitive to the unique challenges that your undocumented students may face. That's super important. When I was in high school, I did have a couple of supportive teachers and counselors, but a lot of people, I mean, I wouldn't say they weren't supportive, but when I was in high school, and to give you some insight into my age, I graduated from high school in 2011. But at that time, people weren't talking about immigration as much as they talk about it now. And so a lot of folks just may not know. And so I would encourage all of you to educate yourself on these policies and on the issues that impact undocumented people as a whole. Not only your students, but also their family members. Because just having that sensitivity to these issues and supporting your students is super important. Making them feel like they have you on their side is important. I would recommend that undocumented students cast a wide nationwide net for college admission. Apply to as many schools as possible, because when your status hinders you from being able to attend college, you want to cast as wide of a net as possible. And you want to encourage your students to research the specific institutional policies at these schools towards undocumented students. And that factors into the next point. Research private universities, because private universities can offer their scholarship money and they can admit whoever they decide to admit. That's how I was able to go to college. I went to Mercer University in Macon. I think I saw Jackie in the participant list. She and I went to college together. But Mercer was generous enough to admit me as an undocumented person before I had DACA protection. And they also offered me a full tuition scholarship despite my immigration status. And so, developing these relationships with these college admissions folks and just getting to know the policies at these specific schools and then passing that information along to your students is super important. Recommending that students research different scholarship opportunities that are available despite immigration status. Support your students in their advocacy efforts, but also recognize the risk. A lot of advocacy nowadays has to do with something called civil disobedience, where people actually go to these Board of Regents meetings and they disrupt the meeting, or they sit in on the meeting and they're asked to leave, but then they don't leave because they're trying to send a message. I would not advise undocumented students or DACA recipients to participate in those legally risky types of advocacy efforts. I would encourage anyone who's interested in doing something like that to consult with an immigration attorney just to kind of assess the risk. But if your students are interested in that kind of advocacy work, just encourage them to seek counsel, and encourage students who are their friends who might be interested in advocating on their behalf to do the things that may be more risky than other things. So the last thing I want to mention, and I recognize that we're out of time here, but if all else fails, encourage them to fundraise for their schooling. So admission is one thing, but then paying for college is another thing. There are folks out there who are willing to support undocumented students and who are willing to give to undocumented students' efforts to gain a higher education. For example, my girlfriend, she is a DACA recipient too, and she is in law school at Syracuse University in New York, and she was able to get a full scholarship for at least her first year of law school, thanks to her academic merit. But because she's going to be spending the next 3 years of law school not working, she has no access to federal student loans because of her immigration status, she decided to fundraise for her living expenses while she's living in Syracuse. And she was able to, with the support of our community, our family, our friends. She was able to raise $12,000 for her first year of law school, which will completely cover all of her living expenses while she lives in New York. So there are supportive people out there. And I would encourage students not to be afraid to fundraise, not be afraid to ask for help whenever they need it. So I'm just going to go through this really quickly. Consider legal action. As I mentioned, there are opportunities out there to file lawsuits if a policy seems unfair. I was actually a plaintiff in a lawsuit against the state of Georgia in 2013, in this case called Olvera versus the University System of Georgia. And essentially, we sued the government because the Department of Homeland Security says that people with DACA are here in the United States lawfully, that they are lawfully present in this country. And so I'm not going to go back to our last slide about the policy specifically here in Georgia, but there is specific language in the Board of Regents policy that says that people who are lawfully present here in the United States, or excuse me, people who are lawfully present in the state of Georgia have eligibility for instant tuition. And so we sued on this very basis, and we made it all the way to the US, or not the US Supreme Court, but the Georgia Supreme Court, where we ultimately lost that lawsuit on a legal technicality called sovereign immunity. I don't know if there are any former attorneys in the audience. You know, some people make career changes, I understand, but some of you may understand that doctrine. But I just want to go ahead and wrap this up because we are about 5 minutes over time. If anyone wants to discuss this further, if you have any questions about a specific student or any questions about how to approach your work, my email address is right here on this page. Feel free to get in touch. But I'd like to take this time now to answer any questions that you all have. I see one here in front of me in the Q&A from Steve. Steve says, is there a site or a resource that reports estimated K-12 DACA populations per state throughout the Southeast? Okay, Kaylee, Kaylee would like to answer this question live.
Oh no, I'm giving that to you. I'm just marking it so it'll go. I'm gonna let you take that answer, Raymond.
No worries. I've never used the Q&A function in Zoom, so this is kind of interesting. But yes, I would research a resource called the Migration Policy Institute, or MPI, Migration Policy Institute. It's a really great organization that collects data on a whole bunch of stuff, not just for DACA, but a whole bunch of different immigration related stats that would be helpful, I think, to you in your work. I also, I serve on the board of directors of an organization here in Georgia called Freedom University. You can go to our website, www.freedom-university.org, and there's some really helpful tidbits in there as well. Freedom U is an organization that seeks to provide higher education opportunities to young undocumented people who are otherwise prevented from accessing those opportunities. Freedom U has partnerships with colleges and universities across the country that offer full tuition scholarships to undocumented students. And in